As he walked past the farmer, the millionaire froze when he saw the pendant, the same one his son wore when he disappeared many years ago. The afternoon sun hung low over Silver Creek Valley, painting the Texas sky in shades of amber and rose. Richard Coleman had driven this stretch of highway 1,000 times in his 53 years, but he'd never once stopped at the roadside produce stands that dotted the landscape like forgotten prayers. Today was different. Today, his driver had called in sick, and Richard, always prepared, always in control, found himself alone behind the wheel with a throat gone dry and no water in sight. He pulled his black Mercedes onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching against loose stones. Dust swirled up around the car as he killed the engine, and for a moment, he just sat there, staring at the humble stand ahead. Corn, pumpkins, hand-painted signs advertising honey and preserves, the kind of place that existed in a world he'd left behind decades ago. Richard stepped out, straightening his charcoal suit jacket out of habit. The heat hit him immediately, that thick, honest heat that reminded him he was still in Texas, no matter how many boardrooms he'd conquered in Dallas. He walked toward the stand, his Italian leather shoes feeling absurdly out of place on the dirt path. That's when he saw him. The young man couldn't have been more than 29, maybe 30. Sun-bronzed skin, calloused hands arranging ears of corn with the kind of care that spoke of genuine pride in his work. He wore faded jeans and a plain white t-shirt, and when he looked up at Richard's approach, his smile was easy, unguarded, the kind of smile Richard had forgotten people could still manage. "Afternoon, sir," the young man said. "Hot one today, isn't it? Can I help you with something?" Richard opened his mouth to ask about water, but the words died in his throat. His eyes had locked onto something that shouldn't exist, something impossible. Hanging from a simple leather cord around the young man's neck was a silver medallion, oval-shaped, worn smooth by time and touch. Even from several feet away, Richard could make out the image of St. Christopher on the front, carrying the Christ child across a river. The world tilted. Richard's hand shot out, gripping the edge of the wooden stand for support. His vision tunneled. His heartbeat roared in his ears like a freight train bearing down on everything he'd built to forget. "Sir, you all right?" The young man's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You need to sit down. I've got a chair right here. That medallion," Richard's voice came out strangled, barely recognizable as his own. "Where did you get it?" The young man's hand went instinctively to the piece at his throat, his easy smile faltering. "This, I've had it forever, since I was little." "How little?" Richard took a step forward, and something in his intensity made the young man take a step back. "How long have you had it?" "I don't know, The young man's brow furrowed. "Look, mister, I don't want any trouble if this is about—" "Please," the word cracked coming out. Richard held up his hands, trying to steady himself, trying to breathe. "Please, I just need to know. Where did you get that medallion?" The young man studied him for a long moment, clearly torn between suspicion and something else. Maybe pity for this well-dressed stranger who looked like he was coming apart at the seams. Finally, he sighed. "My dad gave it to me. Well, not gave exactly. I was wearing it when he found me." The earth dropped out from under Richard's feet. "Found you?" he whispered. "Yeah." The young man's voice went soft, the way people's voices do when they touch on old wounds that never quite healed. "When I was about 3, I guess. I don't remember any of it, Earl. My dad. He found me on a rural road about 15 miles from here, just wandering, alone. I was wearing this medallion and nothing else that could identify me. No one ever came looking." Richard's legs gave out. He stumbled backward, his hand finding the hood of his Mercedes, the hot metal burning through his palm. But he barely felt it. Barely felt anything except the crushing weight of 26 years collapsing on top of him. "Sir," the young man moved toward him now, concern overriding caution. "Seriously, you need water or something. Should I call someone?" But Richard was somewhere else, somewhere he'd spent 26 years trying not to go. Houston, county fair, September heat, the smell of fried dough and livestock. His phone pressed to his ear, Marcus on the other end talking about the Henderson deal, about millions on the line, about signatures needed today. Today? Couldn't it wait until Monday? No. Richard had said, his voice sharp with irritation. "No, it can't wait. I'll handle it now." Linda's voice strained. "Richard, Sebastian, just in a minute," he'd snapped, waving her off. The call had lasted 3 minutes, maybe 4, when he'd finally looked up. Linda was crying. Sebastian's small hand was no longer in hers. His 3-year-old son, wearing his favorite blue shirt and the silver St. Christopher medallion Richard had placed around his neck that very morning, was gone. They'd searched for weeks, months. The police, the FBI, private investigators, every lead turned to ash. Every hope became another knife in his chest. Linda had looked at him with eyes full of blame, deserved blame, until she couldn't look at him at all. The divorce came quietly, like everything else that mattered in his life had learned to do, and Richard had built an empire on the grave of his family, brick by brick, deal by deal, until he was so far removed from the man who'd stood at that county fair that he could almost pretend that man had never existed. Almost. Now, standing in the Texas heat beside a roadside produce stand, Richard Coleman did something he hadn't done in 26 years. He wept. Not the dignified, silent tears of a funeral. These were the raw, gasping sobs of a man breaking open after decades of being sealed shut. His shoulders shook. His carefully maintained composure shattered like glass. The young man stood frozen, clearly terrified and utterly confused. "Sir, please just tell me what's happening. Can I—" Richard forced the words out between ragged breaths. "Can I see it, the medallion, please? I just need to see it up close." The young man hesitated, then slowly lifted the leather cord over his head. He stepped forward and placed the medallion in Richard's trembling palm. Richard turned it over with shaking fingers. The silver felt warm from the young man's body heat. On the back, worn but still legible, was an inscription in careful script. "For Sebastian, may God protect you always, Dad." Richard's knees hit the gravel. He didn't feel the stones cutting through his expensive suit pants. Didn't hear the sound that came out of him. Something between a laugh and a prayer. His fingers closed around the medallion like a drowning man finding shore. "Sebastian," he breathed. His name was Sebastian. The young man crouched down beside him, his face pale. What are you saying?" Richard looked up, tears streaming down his face. And for the first time in 26 years, he let himself say the words he'd buried so deep, he'd almost forgotten they existed. "I'm saying that medallion belonged to my son. I'm saying I put it around his neck the day he disappeared." Richard's voice broke. "I'm saying you might be him. You might be my Sebastian." The young man rocked back on his heels, his mouth opening and closing without sound. His own eyes began to glisten. "My name," he said slowly, "is Ethan. Ethan Wells. That's the only name I've ever known." 26 years ago, Richard said, gripping the medallion so hard his knuckles went white. "My 3-year-old son vanished at a county fair in Houston. He was wearing this medallion. I never saw him again." He held the medallion up between them. "Until today." Ethan stared at the silver oval, at the inscription he'd probably never been able to fully read in all these years. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "What are you asking me?" Richard wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to steady his breathing, trying to think through the roar of hope and terror in his chest. "I'm asking if you'll come with me. I'm asking if you'll let me find out the truth." He met Ethan's eyes. Sebastian's eyes, maybe. God, maybe. And forced himself to be honest. "I'm asking if you'll give me a chance to find my son." Ethan looked down at his calloused hands, at the medallion still resting in Richard's palm, at the impossible intersection of past and present crystallized in one small piece of silver. Then, slowly, he nodded. The drive to Austin took 3 hours, but it felt like 3 minutes and 3 lifetimes all at once. Ethan sat in the passenger seat of Richard's Mercedes, his calloused fingers tracing the edge of the window frame, watching the Texas landscape blur past. Neither man spoke much. What could you say when the entire foundation of your life might be built on a mistake? Richard gripped the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Every few minutes, he'd glance over at Ethan, at the slope of his nose, the set of his jaw, searching for traces of the 3-year-old boy he'd lost. Or maybe searching for proof that this wasn't just desperate hope dressed up as certainty. "You didn't have to close up the stand," Richard said finally, his voice still rough from crying. I could have waited. Ethan shrugged. Not like I was going to sell much more today anyway. Besides, if you're right about... He trailed off, shaking his head. If you're right, then corn doesn't matter much, does it? And if I'm wrong, then I'll go back tomorrow and nothing will have changed. But the way Ethan said it suggested he didn't quite believe that anymore. They stopped at a private clinic in Austin, the kind of place where money bought discretion and speed. Richard had called ahead. By the time they arrived, a lab technician was waiting with consent forms and sterile swabs. The whole process took less than 20 minutes. Results in 48 hours, the technician said, peeling off her gloves. We'll call as soon as they're ready. 48 hours, 2 days to find out if the past 26 years had been a cosmic mistake or just another cruel coincidence in a world full of them. Richard booked them rooms at a hotel downtown, separate floors. He didn't want to crowd the kid, didn't want to seem like he was taking anything for granted. But around 7 that evening, his phone buzzed with a text from Ethan's number. Can't sleep. You want to get dinner or something. They met in the hotel restaurant, a quiet place with dim lighting and soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. Ethan looked out of place in his worn jeans and work boots, but he didn't seem to care. Richard had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, trying to bridge the gap between their worlds. So, Ethan said once they'd ordered, tell me about him. About Sebastian. Richard's throat tightened. He'd spent 26 years trying not to think about Sebastian, and now this stranger, this possible miracle, was asking him to remember everything. He was curious, Richard said slowly, about everything. You couldn't take him anywhere without him asking a million questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do birds fly? Why can't I see the wind? A sad smile tugged at his lips. Linda used to joke that his first word wasn't mama or dada, it was why. Linda, my ex-wife, Sebastian's mother. Richard took a long drink of water. We divorced about a year after he disappeared. Neither of us could. We just couldn't look at each other anymore without seeing what we'd lost. Ethan nodded slowly. Earl, the man who raised me. He used to say that grief is like a third person in the room. Always there, even when nobody mentions it. Earl sounds like he was a good man. The best. Ethan's voice went soft. He died 5 years ago. Cancer. I was with him at the end. He paused. He never told me much about the day he found me, just that I was wandering on Route 71, about 15 miles outside Silver Creek Valley. No shoes, no nothing except that medallion. He took me to the sheriff, but nobody ever filed a missing persons report that matched. After a few months, Earl just kept me, raised me as his own. Richard felt a strange cocktail of emotions. Gratitude toward this Earl for saving his son's life, and a sharp, irrational jealousy that someone else had gotten to raise the boy he'd lost. What was he like? Richard asked. Earl, simple, honest. He taught me to work with my hands, to respect the land. He didn't have much, but what he had, he shared. Ethan met Richard's eyes. He was a good father. The words hung between them like a gentle accusation. He was a good father, and the implication was clear. Were you? Sebastian loved music, Richard said, changing the subject before the guilt could choke him. Especially piano, Linda played, and sometimes she'd sit him on her lap and let him bang away at the keys. He'd laugh this big, belly laugh like it was the funniest thing in the world. Richard's voice cracked. God, that laugh. I can still hear it sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. I play guitar, Ethan offered quietly. Earl taught me. Nothing fancy, just campfire stuff, but I liked it. Music in the blood, maybe. They talked through dinner, and long after the plates had been cleared. Richard told stories about Sebastian's obsession with fire trucks, about how he'd refused to wear anything but his blue shirt for a whole month, about the time he'd tried to give the neighbor's cat a bath and ended up soaked himself. Ethan listened to all of it with an expression Richard couldn't quite read. Part wonder, part grief, like he was mourning a childhood he couldn't remember. What was I like? Ethan asked suddenly. Before that day at the fair, was I happy? Richard's eyes burned. You were the happiest kid I'd ever seen. You lit up every room you walked into. And he had to stop, had to breathe through the tsunami of regret. I took it for granted. I thought there'd always be more time, more chances. I was so focused on building the business, on making something of myself, that I didn't see what I already had. That's why you blamed yourself. That's why everyone blamed me, including me. Richard set down his glass before his shaking hands could drop it. I was on a phone call when it happened, a business call that couldn't wait. Linda was watching him, but she got distracted for just a second, just 1 second. And when we looked back, he couldn't finish the sentence. Ethan reached across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, placed his hand over Richard's. The gesture was awkward, but genuine. "If the DNA comes back positive," Ethan said, "I'm not gonna lie to you. I don't know what that means. I don't know if I can be whoever you need me to be. I don't need you to be anyone except who you are. But who am I?" Ethan pulled his hand back, frustration creeping into his voice. "Am I Ethan Wells, the guy who sells corn at a roadside stand? Or am I Sebastian Coleman, heir to some business empire I don't know anything about? How do I even start figuring that out?" "One step at a time," Richard said. "First, we get the results. Then we deal with whatever comes next." But when the call came 2 days later, Richard realized that knowing the truth was just the beginning of a much longer, more complicated journey. He'd answered on the first ring, putting the phone on speaker so Ethan could hear. The technician's voice was professionally neutral. "Mr. Coleman, we have your results. The DNA analysis shows a 99.9% probability of paternity. Ethan Wells is biologically your son." The hotel room went silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. Richard sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. Ethan stood by the window, his back to Richard, his shoulders rigid. "Thank you," Richard managed. "Thank you for..." The technician was still talking, something about formal documentation and certified copies. But Richard barely heard her. He ended the call and stared at the phone in his hand like it held the secrets of the universe. "Ethan," he said, "I need a minute." Ethan's voice was tight. I need a minute." Richard wanted to go to him, wanted to pull his son into his arms and never let go, but he could see the tension in Ethan's body, could sense that the young man was barely holding himself together. So Richard stayed where he was and waited while his son, after 26 years, processed the truth that changed everything. The Coleman mansion sat on 12 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in the Highland Park district of Dallas, where money whispered instead of shouted and every hedge was trimmed with surgical precision. Ethan stared out the Mercedes window as they passed through iron gates that probably cost more than Earl's entire farm, and felt his stomach twist into knots. "It's just a house," Richard said quietly, reading his expression. "Right, just a house with its own zip code." Richard almost smiled. "It's ostentatious, I know that. Victoria insisted on it when we married. Said it was important for the business, for appearances." He pulled into the circular driveway, where a fountain featuring 3 stone cherubs sparkled in the afternoon sun. "I would have been happy with something smaller." Ethan didn't respond. He was too busy trying to reconcile the man who'd wept over a roadside produce stand with someone who lived in a place like this. The front door opened before they'd even gotten out of the car. A woman emerged, tall and elegant in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Ethan made in 6 months. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a flawless chignon, her makeup subtle but expertly applied. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, the kind Earl used to line the bottom of chicken coops. Victoria Monroe Coleman smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "Richard, darling, you didn't tell me we were having company." Her gaze swept over Ethan, taking in his worn jeans and work boots, his flannel shirt with the frayed collar. Something flickered across her face. Disdain, maybe, or calculation. "You must be the young man from the news." "News." Ethan glanced at Richard. Richard's jaw tightened. "Victoria, we talked about keeping this private until..." "Oh, don't be naive, darling. You think Coleman Enterprises' CEO finding his long-lost heir wouldn't make headlines." She descended the steps with practiced grace, extending a manicured hand toward Ethan. "I'm Victoria, Richard's wife. Welcome to our home." Ethan shook her hand briefly. Her grip was cool and firm, like shaking hands with a well-dressed snake. "Come inside," Victoria said, turning back toward the house. "I've had Maria prepare the guest suite in the East Wing. I assume you'll be staying." "For a few days," Richard said, "until we figure out next steps." Of course. Next steps. Victoria's smile never wavered. Well, make yourself at home, Mr. Wells. Or should I say Mr. Coleman? Ethan's fine, Ethan muttered. The interior of the mansion was even more intimidating than the outside. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath crystal chandeliers. Original oil paintings lined the walls, the kind you saw in museums. A sweeping staircase curved upward like something from a movie set. Ethan felt like he was tracking dirt with every step, even though his boots were clean. A housekeeper appeared, Maria presumably, and offered to show him to his room. Ethan followed her up the staircase, acutely aware of Richard and Victoria's voices drifting up from below. Too quiet to make out words, but sharp enough to carry tension. The guest suite was bigger than Earl's entire house. A 4-poster bed dominated the room, flanked by antique furniture that looked too expensive to touch. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the grounds. The bathroom featured a tub you could swim in. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and dropped his head into his hands. This wasn't his world. He didn't belong here. DNA test or no DNA test. He was still just a kid from Silver Creek Valley who knew more about crop rotation than corporate boardrooms. What the hell was he supposed to do with all this? A knock at the door pulled him from his spiral. "It's me," Richard's voice came through. "Can I come in?" "Yeah." Richard entered, looking tired. He'd loosened his tie again, and there were new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there that morning. "I'm sorry about Victoria. She can be protective of our privacy. She leaked it to the press, didn't she?" Richard sank into an armchair by the window. "Probably. She likes to control narratives." He rubbed his face. "I should have warned you." "About all of this. The house, the lifestyle, the attention. I've lived in it so long I forget how overwhelming it must look from the outside. It's not just overwhelming, it's insane." Ethan gestured at the opulent room. "Richard, I sell vegetables for a living. I fix my own truck. I've never owned a suit. And you're telling me I'm supposed to be, what, your heir? Take over some business empire. I'm not telling you to be anything you don't want to be. Then what do you want from me?" The question hung in the air between them. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the perfectly manicured gardens. "I want to know you," he said finally. "I want to hear about your life, your dreams, what makes you laugh. I want to make up for 26 years of birthdays and holidays and bedtime stories." His voice cracked. "I want my son back, but I know that's not fair to you. You didn't ask for any of this." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. Earl used to say that fair and life don't keep company very often. Smart man. Yeah, he was. Ethan stood and walked to the balcony doors, looking out at the grounds. "He taught me everything. How to plant, how to harvest, how to fix things when they break, how to be honest, work hard, treat people right." He turned back to Richard. "If I'm really your son, and I guess I am, does that mean I'm supposed to forget all that? Become someone else?" "God, no." Richard stood, moving closer. "Ethan, listen to me. I didn't build Coleman Enterprises because I loved business. I built it because I needed something to pour all the grief and guilt into. Something to keep me from drowning." He met Ethan's eyes. "But you actually built a life. A good life, from what I can see, that's worth more than anything I've accomplished." Before Ethan could respond, Victoria's voice floated up from downstairs. "Richard, your attorney's on the phone. Something about the Henderson merger." Richard closed his eyes briefly, frustration flashing across his face. "I have to take this, but we'll talk more. Okay, tonight I'll order in dinner and we can just talk, like we did in Austin." "Sure," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure of anything anymore. Richard left, and Ethan was alone again with the expensive furniture and the weight of a life that didn't fit. That evening, Richard kept his promise. They ordered pizza, Ethan's choice, which seemed to amuse Richard, and ate in a more casual sitting room away from Victoria's watchful presence. Richard showed him photo albums he'd kept for 26 years, pictures of a chubby-cheeked toddler who might or might not have been Ethan. "That's your grandmother," Richard said, pointing to an elderly woman in one photo. "My mother, she passed 10 years ago, but she never stopped hoping we'd find you. Every Christmas. She'd set an extra place at the table just in case." Ethan stared at the photo, trying to feel some connection to the smiling woman, but she was a stranger, just like everyone else in these pictures. "And this," Richard continued, pulling out a small wooden box, "was your favorite toy, a little fire truck. You took it everywhere." He handed the box to Ethan. Inside, carefully preserved, was a red toy fire truck, its paint chipped from years of play. Ethan picked it up, and for just a moment, the briefest flash, he could almost remember the weight of it in smaller hands, the sound it made when you rolled it across the floor. Then the moment passed, and it was just a toy again. "I don't remember," Ethan said quietly. "Any of it. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. You were 3 years old when..." Richard trailed off. "It's a miracle you survived it all." They talked late into the night. Richard told stories about Sebastian, about Linda, about the life that might have been. Ethan talked about Earl, about the farm, about the simple satisfaction of watching something grow from seed to harvest. And slowly, impossibly, they began to build something. Not a replacement for what was lost. That could never be replaced. But maybe the foundation of something new. Upstairs in the master bedroom, Victoria stood by the window, watching the light from the sitting room spill onto the grounds. Her reflection in the glass was perfectly composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her phone and dialed a number she'd hoped never to use again. "It's me," she said when someone answered. "We have a problem. The boy is real, and Richard believes every word of it." A pause. "No, listen to me. If he legitimizes this heir, I lose everything. We need to discredit him before this goes any further." Another pause. Then her voice hardened. "I don't care how you do it. Just make it happen." She ended the call and smoothed her dress, her reflection staring back with cold determination. 26 years ago, she'd made sure Sebastian Coleman disappeared. She'd be damned if she'd let him reappear now and destroy everything she'd built. The headlines started appearing 3 days after Ethan moved into the mansion. Coleman heir or con artist. DNA results questioned by legal experts. Long-lost son or elaborate scheme inside the Coleman family drama. Millionaire's miracle reunion raises eyebrows among financial advisors. Richard found Ethan in the guest suite, staring at his laptop screen, face pale. A dozen browser tabs were open, each one displaying a different article, each one more damaging than the last. "Don't read that garbage," Richard said, closing the laptop more forcefully than intended. "Little late for that." Ethan's voice was flat. "Apparently, I'm either the luckiest scammer in Texas or a delusional kid with fake DNA results. The internet can't quite decide. It's Victoria. She's behind this. You don't know that. I've been married to her for 8 years, Ethan. I know exactly how she operates." Richard pulled up a chair, sitting heavily. "She controls the narrative. Always has. When something threatens her position, she doesn't attack directly. She plants seeds, lets others do the dirty work while she maintains plausible deniability." Ethan picked up his phone, scrolling through social media. "Well, it's working. Half these comments are calling me a gold digger. The other half think you're having some kind of breakdown and I'm taking advantage of a grieving father." "A grieving father who's been grieving for 26 years. Richard's jaw tightened. "I'll have our PR team issue a statement, set the record straight." "And say what? That the DNA test is real? They're already questioning that." Ethan tossed his phone onto the bed. "Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I should just go back to Silver Creek Valley and pretend none of this ever happened. Is that what you want?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what I want. A week ago, my biggest problem was whether to replant the north field with corn or soybeans. Now I'm supposedly the heir to a fortune I never asked for, living in a house that feels like a museum, and the internet thinks I'm a con artist." He looked at Richard, frustration and hurt warring in his eyes. How do I even begin to process any of this? Before Richard could answer, his phone buzzed, a text from his attorney. "We need to talk now." 20 minutes later, Richard sat in his home office while Marcus Chen, his lawyer for the past 15 years, explained the situation in careful, measured tones. 3 separate law firms have filed motions questioning the validity of the DNA test, Marcus said, spreading documents across Richard's desk. "They're claiming possible contamination, questioning the lab's credentials, suggesting the results were manipulated. That's absurd. We use the most reputable facility in Austin. I know that. You know that. But Victoria's team is very good at creating doubt." Marcus pulled up an email on his tablet. They're also filing paperwork to freeze any potential changes to your will or company structure until this is properly investigated, which could take months, maybe years if they really dig in. Richard felt rage building in his chest. She's trying to bury him before he even has a chance. She's protecting what she sees as her interests. And legally, she has standing to do so as your spouse. Marcus paused. Richard, I need to ask. Are you absolutely certain about this? About Ethan? You think I'd fake my own son's DNA results? No, but I think you're a man who's wanted his son back for 26 years. And I need to know you're seeing this clearly. Marcus's voice softened. I'm your attorney, but I'm also your friend. I need to know you're not setting yourself up for more heartbreak. Richard pulled out the photograph he'd carried in his wallet for 2 decades. Sebastian at 2 years old, gap-toothed grin, wearing that damn medallion. He set it next to a recent photo of Ethan on his phone. Same eyes, same smile, same way of tilting his head when he was thinking. That's my son, Marcus. I know it in my bones. Marcus studied both images, then nodded slowly. Okay, then we fight back. But it's going to get ugly. Victoria has resources, and she's not afraid to use them. The ugliness arrived faster than either of them expected. By the end of the week, a local news station was running an investigative piece featuring interviews with people who claimed to have known Earl Wells, painting him as a man with questionable judgment, and suggesting he might have been involved in something more sinister than a simple roadside rescue. The implications were clear. What if Earl had been part of the kidnapping? What if Ethan had known all along and was now capitalizing on a lucky genetic coincidence? Ethan watched the broadcast in the sitting room, his face carefully blank. Richard sat beside him, fury radiating off him in waves. They're calling Earl a criminal, Ethan said quietly when it ended. The man who raised me, who taught me everything about being decent and honest. They're dragging his name through the mud. I'm so sorry, Do you know what the worst part is? Ethan turned to face Richard. Part of me wonders if they're right. Not about Earl being involved. That's bullshit. But about me. Maybe I am taking advantage. Maybe I saw an opportunity and grabbed it without thinking about what it would cost. You're not. How do you know? You don't really know me, Richard. We've spent what? A week together? You're seeing what you want to see, Sebastian. Your lost son. But I'm not him. I'm Ethan Wells. Some guy who sells corn. And maybe that's all I should be. Before Richard could respond, Victoria appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed as always, carrying a folder. I hate to interrupt, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. But Richard, we need to discuss the Henderson merger. They're getting nervous about all this publicity. Not now, Victoria. Actually, yes now. We're talking about a $100 million deal that could collapse if you don't reassure them that Coleman Enterprises is stable. She glanced at Ethan with what might have been sympathy if it weren't so clearly manufactured. I know this is difficult for everyone, but business doesn't stop for family drama. Family drama. Richard stood, voice dangerous. Is that what you're calling this? What would you call it? Victoria's mask slipped slightly. A stranger shows up with a convenient story and a piece of jewelry, and suddenly you're ready to hand over everything you've built. That's not family, Richard. That's fantasy. He's not a stranger, the DNA. Can be questioned. Is being questioned by multiple reputable sources. Victoria set the folder on the coffee table. I'm not the villain here, Richard. I'm trying to protect you. Protect us. Protect everything we've worked for. We didn't work for anything, Richard said coldly. I built Coleman Enterprises. You married into it. Something flashed in Victoria's eyes. Hurt. Maybe, or rage carefully controlled. I see. And these 8 years we've been married, the board meetings I've attended, the investors I've courted, the deals I've helped close, that was all just decorative. That's not what No, it's fine. I understand. Victoria's voice was ice now. You've found your precious Sebastian, and suddenly I'm expendable. How convenient that he shows up right when you're planning the company's future. She turned to Ethan. Tell me, Mr. Wells, when you saw that medallion in the mirror every morning, did you ever wonder if it might be worth something? If the right desperate millionaire might pay handsomely for a convenient heir? Victoria, that's enough. Richard moved between them, but Ethan stood, meeting Victoria's gaze directly. You want to know what I thought about Every morning, I thought about whether it was going to rain, whether the irrigation system needed fixing, whether I could afford to replace the truck's transmission, or if I'd have to patch it together for another season. His voice was steady, but his hands were clenched. I didn't know this medallion was worth anything except the memory of the man who raised me, and I sure as hell didn't know it would lead me into a house where I'm treated like a criminal for existing. He walked past them both, heading for the door. "Where are you going?" Richard called after him. "For a walk. Or maybe back to Silver Creek Valley, I haven't decided yet." The front door closed with a decisive click. Richard rounded on Victoria. "What the hell is wrong with you?" "What's wrong with me?" "Richard, wake up, you're being played. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're not as sharp as I thought you were." She picked up her folder. "I'll handle Henderson myself. You clearly have more important things to worry about, like whether your long-lost son is going to sue you when this all falls apart." She left in a whisper of expensive perfume and barely contained triumph. Richard stood alone in the sitting room, surrounded by wealth he'd accumulated over decades, and realized that for all his success, he was losing the one thing that actually mattered. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Thought you should know. There's more coming. The past has a way of catching up." A friend Richard stared at the message, ice forming in his gut. Victoria wasn't just questioning Ethan's legitimacy. She was building a case, and something told him the worst was yet to come. Victoria had been planning the dinner party for 2 weeks, ever since the DNA results came back. She'd told Richard it was a necessity. Key investors and board members needed reassurance that Coleman Enterprises remained stable. Despite the unusual family circumstances, Richard had reluctantly agreed. Not realizing he was walking into an ambush, the dining room glittered with crystal and silver, candlelight reflecting off polished mahogany. 20 guests filled the long table. Board members, their spouses, a few select investors, and Victoria's personal attorney. They'd all arrived in luxury cars, dressed in designer clothes, speaking in the careful tones of people who measured every word for its potential value. Ethan sat near the middle of the table, wearing the only suit he owned, a simple navy one he'd bought for Earl's funeral 5 years ago. It fit well enough, but next to the bespoke tailoring surrounding him, it might as well have been from a thrift store. He could feel eyes on him all evening, appraising, judging, finding him wanting. Richard sat at the head of the table with Victoria to his right, her hand occasionally resting on his arm in a possessive gesture that looked affectionate, but felt like a claim of ownership. She'd been the perfect hostess all evening. Charming, gracious, making sure everyone's wine glass stayed full and conversation flowed smoothly, until dessert arrived. "So, Ethan," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly down the table, causing conversations to pause. "Richard tells me you've been running a farming operation in Silver Creek Valley. How fascinating. What would you say is your annual revenue?" Ethan set down his fork slowly. Every eye at the table had turned to him. "I don't really think in those terms," he said carefully. "I make enough to get by." "Oh, but surely you must have some idea. Profit margins, overhead costs, that sort of thing." Victoria's smile was razor sharp. "After all, if you're going to be part of Coleman Enterprises, you'll need to understand how business works at this level. I never said I wanted to be part of—" "Thomas," Victoria turned to a silver-haired man 3 seats down, "didn't you start in agriculture before moving into finance? Perhaps you could give Ethan some advice on scaling up." Thomas Whitmore, chairman of the board, dabbed his mouth with a napkin. "Well, farming is honest work, certainly, but running a multinational corporation requires a different skill set entirely. Strategic thinking, understanding market forces, navigating complex regulatory environments." He smiled at Ethan, not unkindly, but patronizingly. "No offense, young man, but there's a significant learning curve." "None taken," Ethan said, feeling his face heat. "I never claimed to know anything about running a corporation. And yet here you are," Victoria said sweetly, "positioned to inherit one." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Richard's jaw tightened. But before he could speak, Victoria's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Moss, chimed in. "Of course, inheritance law in Texas is quite complex, especially in cases involving contested paternity. Even with DNA evidence, there are often questions about intent, documentation, proper legal procedures." She took a sip of wine. "It can take years to sort out." "Really? The DNA evidence isn't contested?" Richard said, his voice hard. "It's conclusive." "Oh, certainly by the lab that performed it," Patricia said mildly. "But as I'm sure your attorney has explained, there are protocols for chain of custody. Multiple verification standards, particularly when such significant assets are at stake. One test from one facility might not meet the threshold for... Are you suggesting I falsified my own son's DNA results?" Richard's voice cut through the room like a blade. The table went silent. Someone coughed awkwardly. Ice cubes clinked in a water glass. Victoria placed her hand over Richard's, squeezing gently. "Darling, no one is suggesting anything of the sort. Patricia is simply explaining the legal complexities. As any good attorney would." She turned to the rest of the table. "You have to understand, this has been quite emotional for Richard. The idea that Sebastian might be alive after all these years. It's understandably overwhelming. The idea..." Richard pulled his hand away. "Victoria, what I'm saying," Victoria continued, addressing the table rather than Richard, "is that we all need to be careful. Richard is vulnerable right now. He wants so desperately to believe that this young man is his son that he might not be seeing the situation clearly." She looked at Ethan with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "I'm not saying you're intentionally deceiving anyone, Ethan. Perhaps you genuinely believe you're Sebastian Coleman, but belief and reality aren't always the same thing." Ethan felt every eye turn back to him. The pity in some faces was almost worse than the suspicion in others. "I never asked for any of this," he said quietly. "I was happy with my life before." "Were you, though?" This from Margaret Chen, wife of a major investor, her voice gentle but probing, living hand-to-mouth on a small farm, struggling to make ends meet. And then suddenly, this opportunity presents itself. It wasn't an opportunity, it was... Ethan stopped, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound defensive. "A miracle," Victoria supplied. "Yes, that's certainly one way to look at it. The right medallion. The right story, appearing at exactly the right moment in Richard's life." She paused. "It does strain credulity just a bit, doesn't it?" "Victoria." Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. "Stop this now." "Stop what?" "I'm simply voicing the concerns that I'm sure many people at this table share, but are too polite to express." Victoria looked around, inviting confirmation. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one contradicted her. "Richard, I love you. We all care about you. But you have to admit, this situation is highly unusual, and given what's at stake, not just your personal fortune, but the future of a company that employs thousands of people, we have a responsibility to ask difficult questions." Thomas Whitmore cleared his throat. "Victoria does raise valid points, Richard. Perhaps it would be prudent to conduct additional verification. Multiple independent DNA tests, background checks, a thorough investigation into the circumstances of the original disappearance, not because we doubt you, but because proper due diligence protects everyone involved, including Ethan," Patricia added. "If his claim is legitimate, then additional verification only strengthens his position, and if there are any irregularities, it's better to discover them now, rather than after legal proceedings have begun." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan spoke first. "You're right." Everyone turned to look at him. "I said you're right." Ethan met Victoria's eyes directly. "This whole situation is insane. A week ago, I was nobody. Just some guy selling vegetables at a roadside stand. And now I'm sitting in a mansion, wearing a dead man's suit, being accused of being a con artist by people I've never met." He stood, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You want to know the truth? I don't know if I'm Sebastian Coleman. I don't remember being him. All I know is that Earl Wells found me on a road 26 years ago and raised me like I was his own son. He was a good man, an honest man, and I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and let people who never knew him question his character or mine." The room was dead silent. Ethan turned to Richard. "I'm sorry. I know this matters to you. I know you want to believe I'm your son. And maybe I am, but I can't do this." He gestured at the table, at the opulent room, at the life Richard was offering. "This isn't me. It'll never be me." He walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Ethan, wait." Richard pushed back from the table, but Ethan was already gone. Victoria dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, the picture of distress. "Oh, Richard, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to upset him. I was only trying to protect you." Richard looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. Not guilt, not remorse, satisfaction. "You planned this," he said quietly. "All of it. The guest list, the conversation topics, Patricia's convenient legal observations. You set him up to fail. I did no such thing. You wanted him to walk out. You wanted everyone here to see him as unstable, emotional, not fit to be part of this family or this company." Richard's voice grew harder with each word. "You wanted to humiliate him. Richard, you're being paranoid." "Am I?" He looked around the table at the carefully neutral faces, at people he'd known for years suddenly unable to meet his eyes. "Or did I just watch my wife systematically destroy my relationship with my son in front of witnesses who can testify to how unstable and inappropriate he is?" Thomas Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. "Richard, I think emotions are running high. Perhaps we should get out." Richard's voice was steel. "All of you. Dinner is over." "Richard," Victoria started. "I said get out." The guests left quickly, murmuring apologies and excuses, their expensive cars pulling away into the night like ships fleeing a storm. When the last one had gone, Richard turned to Victoria. She stood in the doorway of the dining room, perfectly composed, not a hair out of place. "You have no idea what you've done," Richard said. Victoria's mask finally cracked, just slightly. "I know exactly what I've done. I've protected what's ours, what we built together." "We didn't build anything together, Victoria. I built it. You just moved into the house. And that," Victoria said softly, "is exactly why I did what I did." She turned and walked up the stairs, leaving Richard alone in the wreckage of his carefully constructed life. Somewhere in the darkness outside, Ethan was walking away, and Richard had no idea if he'd ever come back. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study with a bottle of scotch he never opened, staring at the photograph of 3-year-old Sebastian that he kept on his desk. The boy's gap-toothed smile seemed to mock him. "You found me and lost me again in less than 2 weeks. Some father you are, at 3 a.m. His phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. "I'm at a motel off I-35. Not leaving yet. Just needed space. Don't worry." Richard typed, and deleted 5 different responses before settling on. "Take all the time you need. I'm here when you're ready." The reply came immediately. "Thanks." 1 word, but it was enough to let Richard breathe again. He pulled up his laptop and started digging. If Victoria was building a case against Ethan, then Richard needed to build one for him. More than that, he needed to understand what really happened 26 years ago. The official story had always been simple. Sebastian vanished at a county fair, presumed kidnapped, never found. But now, with Ethan alive and well in Silver Creek Valley all these years, that story had holes big enough to drive a truck through. Richard started with the basics. He pulled up old police reports, FBI case files he'd obtained through FOIA requests years ago, private investigator reports that had cost him hundreds of thousands and yielded nothing. He read through them all again with fresh eyes, looking for patterns he'd missed. Then he pulled up Victoria's credit card statements from 26 years ago. It took him 2 hours to find it. Buried in the October 2000 records, a charge from a gas station in Silver Creek Valley, dated 3 days after Sebastian disappeared. Then another charge, a small motel just outside town. 2 nights. Richard sat back, ice spreading through his veins. Victoria had told him she was in New York that week, a last-minute business trip for the gallery where she worked. But she'd been in Silver Creek Valley, the exact place where Earl Wells had found a 3-year-old boy wandering alone on a rural road. It could be coincidence. Texas was a big state, but people traveled. Maybe she'd been visiting someone, taken a detour, had reasons that had nothing to do with Sebastian. But Richard didn't believe in coincidences anymore. He kept digging. Victoria's phone records from that time were harder to access. Carriers only kept them for 7 years. But Richard had resources. Most people didn't. By sunrise, he'd tracked down a former telecom executive who owed him a favor and was willing to bend a few rules. The records showed multiple calls from Victoria's cell phone to a Houston number the week of Sebastian's disappearance. Richard ran the number through a reverse lookup service. It came back registered to a James Thornton, now deceased. But in 2000, James Thornton had been employed by Coleman Enterprises as Richard's personal driver. Richard remembered him. Quiet guy, late 50s, always punctual. He'd retired in 2003 and died of a heart attack in 2008. Richard had sent flowers to the funeral. His hands shook as he reached for his phone. It was barely 6 a.m., but he didn't care. He called Marcus Chen. "This better be an emergency." Marcus answered groggily. "It is. I need you to find someone for me." "James Thornton. He was my driver back in 2000. He's dead now, but he might have family, a wife, children, anyone who might know what he was doing in October of that year. Richard, it's 6 in the morning. I know what time it is. I need this. Marcus, today if possible." Something in Richard's voice must have communicated the urgency. "Okay, give me a few hours. I'll call you back." Richard hung up and stared at the evidence spread across his desk. Credit card statements, phone records, a pattern emerging from the fog of 26 years. Victoria hadn't just questioned Ethan's legitimacy. She'd known all along, because she was the one who'd made him disappear. The study door opened. Victoria stood in the doorway, immaculate even at dawn, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "You're up early," she observed. Richard quickly closed his laptop. "Couldn't sleep." Guilt will do that." She moved into the room, pouring herself coffee from the pot Richard's housekeeper had brought up earlier. "Have you heard from your son?" The way she said "your son" dripped with skepticism. "He's fine." "Is he? Because from where I was standing last night, he looked like someone having a breakdown, very unstable. Several guests commented on it." Victoria sipped her coffee. "Thomas called me this morning. He's concerned. Says maybe you should take some time off. Get some distance from the situation. Thomas can mind his own business. The board is his business, and by extension your mental state is his business when it affects company decisions." Victoria set down her cup. "Richard, I know you're angry with me, but I did what needed to be done. That boy is not equipped to be part of this world. Last night proved it. Last night proved you're willing to humiliate a decent person to protect your own interests. My interests. Everything I've done has been to protect our interests. Yours and mine. The company we've built together." "Stop saying that." Richard stood. "We didn't build anything together. I built Coleman Enterprises long before I met you. You just showed up after the foundation was already laid." Victoria's eyes flashed. "I showed up after your life fell apart. After Linda left you. After you'd spent 5 years drowning in guilt and scotch. I was the one who pulled you back together. I was the one who stood by you when everyone else had written you off as a washed-up has been obsessed with a dead child. He wasn't dead. We didn't know that." Victoria's composure cracked. "For all we knew, Sebastian was gone forever. I helped you accept that. I helped you move on, build something new, and now you want to throw it all away for some farm boy with a convenient story. He's my son. He's a stranger with your DNA. That's not the same thing." Victoria moved closer. "Richard, please, think about what you're risking. The company, your reputation, everything we've worked for. Is it really worth it?" Richard looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. Had she always been this cold, this calculating, or had he just been too broken to notice? "Where were you?" he asked quietly. "In October 2000, the week Sebastian disappeared." Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "What? You told me you were in New York." "But I found credit card charges from Silver Creek Valley, a gas station, a motel, 2 nights." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "I don't remember every business trip I took 26 years ago," Victoria said finally. "This wasn't business. The gallery didn't have any clients in Silver Creek Valley." "Then I must have been visiting someone, Richard. What is this about? You were there, in the exact town where my son was found 3 days after he disappeared. That's one hell of a coincidence." Victoria laughed, but it sounded forced. "Are you seriously suggesting I had something to do with Sebastian's disappearance, Richard? Listen to yourself. You're starting to sound paranoid. Am I? Or am I finally starting to see clearly for the first time in 26 years? His phone rang. "Marcus, I need to take this," Richard said. Victoria's jaw tightened. We're not done with this conversation. Yes, we are. She left, closing the door harder than necessary. Richard answered the call. I found Thornton's widow, Marcus said without preamble. Claire Thornton lives in a nursing home in Austin. Advanced dementia, but I talked to her daughter Lisa. She remembers her father being upset about something in the fall of 2000. Wouldn't talk about it, but Lisa said he started drinking more. Became withdrawn. She always wondered if something happened at work. Did she say anything specific? No, but Richard, there's something else. James Thornton received a payment of $50,000 in October 2000. Cash deposit. No clear source. Lisa found the bank records when settling her father's estate, but never knew where it came from. $50,000. 3 days after Sebastian disappeared. Get me Lisa Thornton's contact information, Richard said. I need to talk to her. Richard, what's going on? I'm getting my son back, and I'm finding out who took him from me. After hanging up, Richard sat in the quiet study, watching dawn light creep across the Dallas skyline. Somewhere in this city, Victoria was probably making calls, shoring up her defenses, preparing for war. Let her. For 26 years, Richard had blamed himself for losing Sebastian, had carried that guilt like a stone around his neck, letting it drag him down into darkness. But now he knew the truth, or at least the shape of it. His son hadn't wandered off, hadn't been randomly kidnapped by a stranger. He'd been taken deliberately by someone who wanted him gone, and Richard was going to prove it. Lisa Thornton lived in a modest house in South Austin, the kind of place where kids' bicycles leaned against the porch and wind chimes sang in the breeze. She answered the door in jeans and a faded Utz sweatshirt, looking wary when she saw Richard standing there in his expensive suit. Mrs. Thornton, I'm Richard Coleman, your lawyer. Marcus Chen said he spoke with you about your father. Recognition flickered across her face, followed quickly by something else. Anxiety, maybe, or fear. Mr. Coleman, I wasn't expecting you to come in person. She glanced over her shoulder into the house. My kids are at school. I guess you can come in. The living room was cluttered but clean, filled with family photos and children's artwork stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. Lisa offered coffee, which Richard declined. They sat across from each other, an awkward silence stretching between them. Your lawyer said you had questions about my father, Lisa said finally. About October 2000. Yes, I know this might be difficult, but it's important. Your father worked for me back then. He was my driver. I remember Dad talked about you sometimes. Said you were going through a hard time after your little boy disappeared. Lisa's voice softened. I'm sorry about that. I can't imagine what it must have been like. Thank you. Richard leaned forward. Lisa, I need to know what happened that October. Marcus said your father received a large cash payment, $50,000. Do you know where it came from? Lisa's hands twisted in her lap. No, Dad never told me, but I knew something was wrong. He changed after that, started drinking, became withdrawn. My mom said he had nightmares, would wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. She looked up, eyes glistening. He died of a heart attack 10 years ago, but I always wondered if the stress from whatever happened contributed to it. Did he ever mention my wife, Victoria Coleman? The question landed like a stone in still water. Lisa's face went pale. He mentioned her once, she said quietly. About 6 months before he died. He was drunk, which wasn't unusual by then. He said something about how some sins are too big to confess, how he'd taken money to do something he couldn't take back, and it had poisoned everything. Did he say what he'd done? No, but he said a name. Sebastian, he kept saying. That little boy, Sebastian. I should have said no. I should have refused. Lisa wiped her eyes. I didn't understand then. I didn't make the connection. Richard felt his heart hammering. Did he say anything else? Anything about what happened to Sebastian? Lisa stood. Walking to a bookshelf in the corner, she pulled out a worn shoebox and brought it back to the couch. After Dad died, I found this hidden in his closet. Mom didn't want to keep it, said it gave her bad feelings, but I couldn't throw it away. She opened the box. Inside were old receipts, a few photographs, and a small digital recorder, the kind reporters used to use. There's a recording on here, Lisa said. I've never had the courage to listen to it. The date on the file says October 2000. Richard's hands trembled as he took the recorder. May I? Lisa nodded. If it helps you find answers about your son, then yes. God knows Dad carried whatever this was to his grave. Maybe it's time someone finally knew the truth. Richard pressed play. There was static. Then James Thornton's voice, slurred with alcohol. October 15th, 2000. My name is James Thornton, and I need to confess something before it kills me. I did something terrible, something I can't take back. A long pause. The sound of liquid pouring. Whiskey, probably. Mrs. Coleman came to me 3 days after the kid disappeared, offered me $50,000 cash, said she needed me to do something. No questions asked. I needed the money. Claire's medical bills were piling up, and we were drowning in debt, so I said yes. Another pause. Richard could hear his own heartbeat. She told me to drive out to Silver Creek Valley. Said there'd be a kid there, maybe 3 or 4 years old, wandering by the side of Route 71. She gave me the exact location, made me promise I'd leave him there, in the middle of nowhere, and drive away. Said he'd be found eventually, taken to foster care or adopted. Said it was better this way. Richard's vision blurred with tears. I didn't ask questions, didn't want to know, but I knew, deep down, that was Mr. Coleman's boy, the one who'd gone missing from the fair, and Mrs. Coleman. She'd taken him, made him disappear, and she paid me to make sure he stayed disappeared. A sound like sobbing came through the recording. I drove out there, found the kid exactly where she said he'd be. He was crying, alone, scared, wearing a little silver medallion around his neck. He looked up at me with these big eyes and asked if I was going to take him home. And James Thornton's voice broke. I left him there, drove away and left a 3-year-old kid on a deserted road in the middle of nowhere. For $50,000. What kind of man does that? What kind of monster? Silence then. I don't know if he survived. Don't know if someone found him or if he died out there in the heat. I'm too much of a coward to find out. I took the money, paid off our debts, and told myself I did what I had to do. But it's killing me. Every day, I see that kid's face. Every night, I hear him asking if I'm taking him home. The recording ended with the click of the stop button. Richard sat frozen, the recorder heavy in his hand. The room spun around him. For 26 years, he'd blamed himself, had carried the guilt of that one distracted moment, convinced his negligence had cost Sebastian his life, but it had never been his fault. Not really. Victoria had taken his son, had paid someone to abandon a 3-year-old child in the middle of nowhere, leaving him to whatever fate awaited. Mr. Coleman. Lisa's voice seemed to come from far away. Are you okay? Richard looked up, tears streaming down his face. Sebastian survived. The boy your father left on that road. He survived. A farmer named Earl Wells found him and raised him. He's alive. Lisa's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, you found him. Yes, 3 weeks ago. Richard stood, his legs unsteady. And my wife has been trying to destroy his credibility ever since. Trying to make everyone believe he's a fraud. He looked at Lisa. I need this recording. I need to make sure what your father did, what Victoria made him do, never happens again. Take it, Lisa said immediately. Please, if it helps your son, if it brings justice, then take it. Dad would want that. He carried this guilt his whole life. Maybe this can finally put him to rest. Richard pocketed the recorder, his mind racing. He had the evidence now, proof of Victoria's involvement, but taking her down meant exposing everything. The kidnapping, the conspiracy, the years of lies. It meant destroying the carefully constructed image of Coleman Enterprises, risking the company, his reputation, everything he'd built. He thought about Ethan in that motel room off I-35, alone and confused, believing he didn't belong anywhere. The choice wasn't hard at all. Thank you, Richard said to Lisa. Your father may have made a terrible mistake, but by recording this, he gave my son a chance at justice. That means something. Lisa walked him to the door. Mr. Coleman, I hope you and your son can find peace. God knows too many people have suffered because of this already. Richard drove back to Dallas in a daze, the recorder burning a hole in his pocket. He called Marcus from the car. I need you to convene an emergency board meeting, Richard said. Richard, tomorrow morning everyone needs to be there, Victoria included. Richard, what's going on? I'm going to expose the person who kidnapped my son, and then I'm going to make sure they pay for every single day of the last 26 years. He hung up and dialed Ethan's number. It rang 4 times before Ethan answered, voice cautious. Richard. I know what happened to you, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. I know who took you from me, and I'm going to make it right. What are you talking about? Come back to Dallas. Please, I need you there tomorrow morning. I need you to hear the truth. There was a long pause, then, okay, I'll be there. Richard hung up and stared at the highway stretching ahead. Tomorrow, everything would change. The truth would finally come to light, and Victoria's carefully constructed world would burn to the ground. The boardroom of Coleman Enterprises occupied the entire top floor of the downtown Dallas Tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city Richard had conquered. 24 leather chairs surrounded a massive oak table. By 9 a.m., every seat was filled. Board members sat in tense silence, glancing at each other with barely concealed curiosity. Marcus Chen had been cryptic in his emails, saying only that Richard had called an emergency meeting regarding matters critical to the company's future. Victoria sat at Richard's right hand. Immaculate in a charcoal suit, her expression one of controlled concern. Does anyone know what this is about? Thomas Whitmore whispered to the woman beside him, before anyone could answer. The boardroom doors opened. Richard entered, followed by Ethan and Marcus. Ethan looked uncomfortable in a borrowed suit, but he held his head high. Behind them came a woman in her 50s, Lisa Thornton, and a court stenographer Marcus had hired to create an official record. Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment when she saw Lisa, but she recovered quickly. Richard, darling, what's all this? Victoria's voice was honey-sweet. You said this was a board meeting, not a family reunion. It's both. Richard moved to the head of the table but remained standing. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I know you have questions. You're about to get answers. He pulled out a small digital recorder and set it on the table. The gesture seemed almost theatrical, but Richard's face was grave. 26 years ago, my 3-year-old son Sebastian disappeared from a county fair in Houston. The police investigated, the FBI investigated, private detectives searched for years. We found nothing. My marriage fell apart, my life fell apart, and I spent the next 2 decades convinced it was my fault. That one moment of distraction had cost my son his life. The room was silent. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. 3 weeks ago, I met a young man at a roadside produce stand. He was wearing a medallion I'd placed around Sebastian's neck the day he disappeared. DNA testing confirmed what I already knew in my heart. This young man is my son, Richard gestured to Ethan. He was found wandering on a rural road in Silver Creek Valley when he was 3 years old. A farmer named Earl Wells took him in and raised him. For 26 years, I didn't know my son was alive. Victoria spoke up, her voice carefully modulated. Richard, we've been over this. No one is disputing the DNA results anymore, but this is hardly the venue. I'm not finished. Richard's voice cut like steel. I spent the last week investigating what really happened that day. How a 3-year-old boy could vanish from a crowded fair and end up on a deserted road 100 miles away. And I found answers. He pressed play on the recorder. James Thornton's voice filled the boardroom. Mrs. Coleman came to me 3 days after the kid disappeared. Offered me $50,000 cash. Said she needed me to do something. No questions asked. Victoria's face went white. She stood abruptly. Richard, stop this right now. This is... Sit down. Richard's voice was ice. You wanted a board meeting. You're going to get one. The recording continued. The room listened in stunned silence as James Thornton confessed to abandoning a 3-year-old child in the middle of nowhere on Victoria's orders. When it ended, no one moved. That recording, Richard said, was made by my former driver, James Thornton, in October 2000. He's since deceased, but his daughter Lisa is here today. He gestured to Lisa, who sat pale and trembling near the door. She's provided bank records showing a $50,000 cash deposit into her father's account 3 days after Sebastian disappeared. Richard pulled out a folder and began distributing documents around the table. I also have Victoria's credit card statements from that week, showing charges at a gas station and motel in Silver Creek Valley, the exact location where Sebastian was found, phone records showing multiple calls between Victoria and James Thornton during that time, and a financial analysis showing that Victoria stood to gain significantly from Sebastian's disappearance. "This is ridiculous," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "That recording could be fake. Those records could be doctored. Richard is having some kind of breakdown. And he's taking all of you with him. I wish that were true." Richard's voice broke slightly. "I wish I was losing my mind. Because the alternative, that the woman I married, the woman I trusted, orchestrated my son's kidnapping, is almost too horrible to comprehend." Thomas Whitmore picked up one of the documents, studying it carefully. "Victoria, these are serious allegations. Perhaps you'd like to respond." "I don't have to respond to anything. This is character assassination, pure and simple." Victoria turned to Richard, her mask finally cracking. "You want to know why? Fine, I'll tell you why." The room went deadly still. "You never loved me, Richard. Never. I was always second best. Second to Linda, second to your precious Sebastian, second to the ghost of a family you couldn't let go of." Victoria's voice rose, years of resentment pouring out. "Do you know what it's like? Being married to a man who's in love with his own grief, who keeps a shrine to a lost child in his study, who looks at you every single day and wishes you were someone else. So you took my son," Richard said quietly. "You made him disappear so there'd be nothing standing between us. I did it for us." Victoria's composure shattered completely. "I thought if Sebastian was gone, really gone, you could finally move on. We could build something new, something that was ours. But even with him gone, you never let go. You just built a bigger empire to hide behind." Ethan stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Everyone turned to look at him. "You took me from my father," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "You paid someone to abandon a 3-year-old kid in the middle of nowhere. I could have died out there, and you did it because what? Because you were jealous." Victoria looked at Ethan, and for the first time, something like guilt flashed across her face. "I never meant for you to get hurt. I thought someone would find you quickly. A nice family would adopt you. You'd have a good life, and Richard could finally be free." "Free?" Richard's laugh was bitter. "I've spent 26 years in prison, Victoria. A prison you built. You built it yourself," Victoria fired back. "Every night you spent in that study, staring at photographs, every birthday you marked alone, every Christmas with an empty place at the table, you chose that grief. You wallowed in it. I tried to help you move on, but you wouldn't let me, because I lost my son, and I lost my husband." Victoria's voice cracked. "From the moment we met, you were never really mine. I thought if I could just remove the obstacle, if I could make Sebastian disappear, maybe you'd finally see me. But even with him gone, you loved the ghost more than you ever loved me." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Patricia Moss, Victoria's own attorney, stood up slowly. "Victoria," Patricia said carefully, "I strongly advise you to stop talking and request legal counsel." But Victoria was past caring. 26 years of pretending, of playing the supportive wife, of living in the shadow of a missing child. It all came pouring out. "I don't need legal counsel. I need a drink and a divorce." She looked around the boardroom at the horrified faces. "Go ahead. Call the police. Arrest me. I don't care anymore. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of losing to a memory." "You didn't lose to a memory," Ethan said quietly. "You lost to yourself. My father made a mistake 26 years ago. One moment of distraction. But you made a choice. You took a child from his family because you couldn't handle being second place. And you know what? That says a lot more about you than it ever did about him." Victoria stared at Ethan, and something in her eyes went flat. "You're right. I made a choice, and I'd make it again. Because at least I tried to fight for what I wanted." "What did you ever fight for?" "Farm boy. Corn. I fought to survive," Ethan said. "Every day after you left me on that road to die, I fought to survive, and I did. Without your money, without your mansion, without anything except a good man who found me and showed me what real love looks like. So yeah, maybe I'm just a farm boy, but at least I'm not a monster." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard picked up the phone on the conference table and dialed. "Security, please send someone up to the boardroom. We have a situation that requires police intervention." Victoria didn't resist when security arrived. didn't even look back as they escorted her from the room. She just walked out with her head high, leaving behind 26 years of carefully constructed lies. After she was gone, Thomas Whitmore cleared his throat. "Richard, I think I speak for the entire board when I say we're deeply sorry for what you've endured and grateful that you've finally found your son." Richard nodded, unable to speak. He looked at Ethan, standing there in a borrowed suit, and felt something break open in his chest. Not more grief, but something else. Something that might eventually become healing. "Thank you all for being here," Richard managed. "I'll need some time to sort through the legal ramifications. Marcus will keep you updated," as the board members filed out, murmuring condolences and shock. Ethan approached Richard. "What happens now?" Ethan asked. Richard looked at his son, really looked at him, not searching for traces of the 3-year-old he'd lost, but seeing the man standing before him. "Now," Richard said, "now we figure out what comes next. Together." For the first time in 26 years, the future didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a possibility. Victoria was arrested that afternoon. The charges were severe: kidnapping, conspiracy, child endangerment. Media trucks lined up outside Coleman Enterprises like vultures, cameras ready to capture the fallen queen's downfall. Richard watched from his office window as Victoria was led out in handcuffs, her perfect posture finally broken. Part of him felt vindicated. Mostly, he just felt tired. "You don't have to watch this," Marcus said from the doorway. "Yes, I do." Richard turned away. "I married her, trusted her. I need to see what that trust cost. She made her choices, Richard. This isn't on you, isn't it?" Richard sank into his chair. "I was so consumed by grief that I didn't see what she was capable of. Maybe if I'd been more present." "Stop!" Ethan's voice came from the corner. "You're doing it again, taking responsibility for someone else's choices. She kidnapped me because she wanted control. That's on her." Richard looked at his son and felt something loosen in his chest. "When did you get so wise? Earl used to say that suffering either makes you bitter or better. I chose better." Ethan moved closer. "Look, I'm not going to pretend the last 26 years didn't happen. Earl raised me, but I also can't pretend you're not my father. So we figure this out. Together." Marcus cleared his throat. "Speaking of figuring things out, we need to discuss next steps. Legal proceedings, press statements, corporate restructuring. Victoria held significant positions. Her removal creates vacancies." "I don't want to talk about corporate restructuring right now," Richard said. "I know, but the board will want answers. Investors are spooked. We need to show stability." Richard rubbed his face. "Give me a week, 1 week to sort through this. Then we'll deal with the company." Marcus nodded and left. Richard and Ethan sat in silence, the weight of everything settling over them. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said finally. "Anything. Do you want me to be part of the company? Is that what this is about?" Richard looked up sharply. "No, God, no, Ethan. I don't want you to be anything except who you are. If that's a farmer in Silver Creek Valley, then that's what you should be. But I'm your heir. Everyone keeps saying it. You're my son, that's all that matters." Richard stood. "When I built this company, I told myself it was for Sebastian. But that was a lie. I built it because I didn't know what else to do with the pain, the money, the power. None of it ever filled the hole you left behind." Ethan was quiet. "What about Victoria? What happens to her now? The day says 15 to 20 years. Maybe more." Richard paused. "Marcus thinks I should push for maximum sentence. But I keep thinking about what she said in that boardroom, about feeling second best." Richard shook his head. "What she did was unforgivable, but I wasn't entirely blameless in what our marriage became." "You're not defending her." "No. I'm just trying to understand how someone becomes that desperate. She needs to face consequences, but I don't want revenge. I just want this over so we can move forward." 3 days later, Richard sat across from Victoria in a private meeting room at the county jail. She looked diminished in her orange jumpsuit. "You didn't have to come," Victoria said, voice flat. "I know." They stared at each other. So much history, most of it built on lies. "Why are you here, Richard?" "Because despite everything, I need to understand. Was any of it real? Did you ever actually care about me?" Victoria's composure cracked. "Of course I cared. I loved you, Richard. That's what made it unbearable. Loving someone who could never love you back the same way. I tried. I know. And that almost made it worse. Watching you try while your heart was somewhere else. Victoria wiped her eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want you to know that when I took Sebastian, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was desperate and stupid instead of making space for me. I just made the ghost bigger. Richard felt tears burning. You took 26 years from us. From Sebastian. From me. From Linda. You stole his childhood. You don't. You can't. Victoria leaned forward. But Richard, here's the truth. I'm glad he survived. I'm glad Earl found him. Because if he'd died out there, I couldn't have lived with myself. The guilt was bad enough. If he'd died, she couldn't finish. That doesn't make it better. I know, nothing does. But every day for 26 years I wondered if he was okay. When he showed up, part of me was relieved. At least he was alive. At least I wasn't a murderer. Just a monster. Richard stood. I'm not going to push for maximum sentence. I'll let the justice system decide. But Victoria, I never want to see you again. When you get out, if you get out, stay away from me and my son. I will. Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. Richard, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am sorry. Richard walked to the door, then paused. So am I, for both of us. That evening, Richard returned to find Ethan packing. You're leaving. Richard tried to keep panic out of his voice. Just going back to the farm for a bit. Need to check on things. Ethan zipped his duffel. But I was thinking, maybe you could come with me. See where I grew up, meet people who knew Earl, see what my life was like. Richard felt something warm spread through his chest. I'd like that. And then maybe we figure out what comes next. I don't know if I want to be part of Coleman Enterprises or keep farming or something in between. But whatever it is, we figure it out together. Together. Richard agreed. 2 days later, they drove back to Silver Creek Valley. The mansion sat empty behind them. All its expensive furniture suddenly meaningless. Richard didn't know what the future held. Didn't know if he'd keep the company or sell it. Didn't know if Ethan would choose corporate life or farming. Didn't know how to rebuild a relationship with a son he'd lost for 26 years. But for the first time since that terrible day at the county fair, Richard felt hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind that kept him searching for ghosts, but the solid kind built on truth and possibility. As they passed the roadside produce stand where everything had changed, Ethan pointed out the window. That's where we met. 3 weeks ago. Feels like a lifetime. Feels like yesterday, Richard said. Both, Ethan agreed. It feels like both. They drove on toward Silver Creek Valley, toward Earl's farm, toward a life that was simpler, but somehow more real than anything Richard had built in Dallas. The afternoon sun painted the fields gold, and for the first time in 26 years, Richard Coleman felt like he was finally going home. 6 months had passed since the boardroom confrontation that changed everything. Richard stood on the porch of a modest farmhouse, watching the sun rise over fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The house was simple, nothing like the mansion in Dallas, with weathered wood siding and a tin roof that sang when it rained, but it was home in a way that 12-acre estate had never been. He'd bought the land adjacent to Earl's old farm, the property that Ethan still maintained with the same careful attention Earl had taught him. Together, they'd built this house over the past few months, working side by side in the Texas heat. Richard's hands, once soft from years of boardroom deals, now bore calluses. His expensive suits hung unused in a closet while he lived in jeans and work boots. Coleman Enterprises still existed, but Richard had restructured everything. He'd promoted trusted executives to handle day-to-day operations and moved to a consultant role that allowed him to work remotely. The board had been skeptical at first, but the company's stock had actually risen once the Victoria scandal died down. Turned out investors appreciated a CEO who'd survived a major crisis with integrity intact. The screen door creaked open. Ethan emerged carrying 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Richard. Couldn't sleep either, Ethan asked. Too much on my mind. Richard took the coffee gratefully. Linda called yesterday. She wants to visit next week. After everything came out, Richard had reached out to his ex-wife. The conversation had been difficult. 26 years of pain and blame and what-ifs condensed into a 2-hour phone call. But Linda had agreed to meet Ethan. She deserved that much. Deserved to know her son had survived. How do you feel about that? Ethan asked. Nervous? Hopeful? Terrified? Richard smiled slightly. All of it at once. What about you? Same. Ethan stared out at the fields. It's weird, you know. I spent 29 years not knowing I had parents. Now suddenly I've got 2 of them, plus a whole history I don't remember. Sometimes I wake up and forget where I am, who I'm supposed to be. You're Ethan Coleman, Richard said firmly. You're the man Earl Wells raised. You're the son I lost and found again. You're both. You don't have to choose. That's what the therapist says too. Ethan smiled. Richard had insisted they both see counselors to work through the trauma. It was helping. Slowly. Speaking of which, you have your session this afternoon. I know Dr. Morrison wants to talk about forgiveness, specifically, forgiving myself for that day at the fair. Are you getting there? Richard considered the question. Some days? Other days, I still see that moment in my head. Turning away, taking that call, losing track of you. But I'm starting to understand that one moment of distraction didn't cause all this. Victoria made choices. She's the one who turned a temporary separation into 26 years of loss. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sky lighten from deep purple to pink to gold. In the distance, a tractor rumbled to life. Old Tom Henderson from the neighboring farm, starting his day. I've been thinking, Ethan said, about the land, about what we could do with it. Oh, Coleman Enterprises has all that capital. Right, and you're looking for ways to do something meaningful with the company. Ethan turned to face Richard. What if we started a program? Use some of the land to train young people in sustainable farming, partner with foster care systems, give kids aging out of the system a skill and a purpose. Call it the Earl Wells Agricultural Foundation or something? Richard felt emotion welling up. Ethan, that's brilliant. Earl gave me everything when I had nothing. Seems right to pay that forward. Ethan's voice was thick, and it would give the Coleman name a different legacy. Not just corporate deals and boardroom battles, but something that actually helps people. Let's do it, Richard said immediately. I'll have Marcus draw up the paperwork. We can break ground by fall. Ethan smiled, and in that moment, Richard saw both the 3-year-old boy he'd lost and the man standing before him. The past and present merged into something whole. I'm going to check the irrigation system, Ethan said, setting down his coffee. You coming? Right behind you. They walked through the fields together, talking about water tables and crop rotation and the foundation they'd build. Richard found himself genuinely interested, engaged in a way he'd never been during corporate meetings. This was real. This mattered. Around noon, a car pulled up the long driveway. Marcus climbed out, carrying a briefcase and looking out of place in his suit. I come bearing documents, Marcus announced, pulling out folders. The foundation paperwork you requested. Also, Victoria's sentencing hearing is scheduled for next month. The DA wants to know if you'll provide a victim impact statement. Richard took the folders, setting them aside. I'll think about it, but Marcus, you could have emailed this. You didn't have to drive all the way out here. Marcus looked around at the fields, the modest farmhouse, the simple life Richard had built. I wanted to see for myself. Make sure you weren't having some kind of extended breakdown. And I think this might be the sanest I've ever seen you. Marcus smiled. You look good, Richard. Happy even. I am, for the first time in 26 years, I'm actually happy. Richard gestured toward the house. Stay for lunch. Ethan makes a mean pulled pork sandwich. Over lunch, they discussed the foundation's structure, funding mechanisms, and partnership opportunities. Marcus was impressed by Ethan's vision and business acumen, despite his lack of formal education. You've got good instincts, Marcus told Ethan. Ever think about getting a business degree? Coleman Enterprises would pay for it. Maybe someday, Ethan said. But right now, I'm learning more out here than I ever would in a classroom. After Marcus left, Richard found himself alone in the house, while Ethan went to meet with a supplier in town. He walked through the rooms they'd built together, touching the walls, remembering the conversations they'd had while hammering and painting. On the mantel sat a photograph he'd brought from Dallas, 3-year-old Sebastian smiling at the camera, the medallion visible around his neck. Next to it was a newer photo, Richard and Ethan standing in front of the half-built farmhouse, both sunburned and smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. Richard's phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. Supplier had extra seedlings. Thinking we could plant a memorial garden for Earl. What do you think? Richard typed back. Perfect. I'd like to help. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Richard thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. The loss, the grief, the decades of guilt, Victoria's betrayal and arrest, the shocking truth that had torn apart his carefully constructed life, but also the miracle of finding Ethan alive, the slow, careful rebuilding of a relationship that should have existed all along, the discovery that happiness didn't require mansions or corporate empires. Sometimes it just needed honest work, open sky, and someone to share it with. When Ethan returned home that evening, they worked together planting oak saplings in a small grove near the house, Earl's memorial garden. Each tree represented something: honesty, integrity, resilience, love, the qualities Earl had instilled in Ethan, the qualities that had helped him survive and become the man he was. You would have liked him, Ethan said, patting dirt around a sapling. He was simple, but in the best way. He saw what needed doing and did it. No complaints. When he found me on that road, he didn't overthink it, just took me home and raised me like I was his own. I owe him everything, Richard said quietly. He saved my son's life and gave him a childhood I couldn't. I wish I could thank him. You are thanking him, this foundation, this place, the life we're building. It's all because of what he taught me. Ethan stood, brushing dirt from his hands. He used to say that the best way to honor someone is to live according to what they taught you. So that's what I'm doing. They finished planting as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the same colors Richard had seen that day at the roadside produce stand, the day everything changed. Hey, Dad, Ethan said, the word still tentative but getting easier. You think someday I'll remember being 3 years old, the fair, any of it? I don't know, Richard said honestly, but maybe that's okay. Maybe the past doesn't matter as much as what we do with the time we have now. Yeah, Ethan said. I think you're right. They walked back to the house as darkness fell, the fields around them settling into peaceful quiet. Through the kitchen window, warm light spilled onto the porch. Inside, Richard could see the simple table they'd built, the chairs mismatched but comfortable, the life they were creating from the ashes of everything they'd lost. Richard paused on the porch steps, looking up at stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in Dallas, Victoria sat in a cell, paying for her choices. Somewhere out there, Linda was preparing to meet the son she'd thought was dead. Somewhere in the great unknown, Earl Wells rested, his good work continuing through the man he'd raised. And here, in this simple farmhouse on the edge of Silver Creek Valley, a father and son were finally home. You coming? Ethan called from inside. Richard smiled, taking one last look at the golden fields stretching endlessly into twilight. Yeah, he said. I'm coming. He stepped inside, closing the door on 26 years of darkness, stepping into the light of whatever came next. Together,